So that's it for Auburn, Georgia. But it was one of many giant upsets. Maybe this one wasn't massive, but giant upsets in the weekend. And I really want to get into a couple of these. So let's start off with Michigan and Iowa. There's upsets and then there's upsets. And this is kind of on the giant scale, but it's funny, and we'll get into this in a little bit. It's funny how, because so many teams lost, even these bad upsets didn't really hurt the teams that bad. So we'll talk about that in a second. But for Michigan, an offense that's been fairly dominant this year, 4 yards per attempt, 2.8 yards per rush. But I think there's some hidden truth in here as well, because this is a Michigan team that's really only faced one other, and Iowa's defense isn't that great, one other good defense all year, and that's Wisconsin. And oh, by the way, they managed 14 points. So let's talk about Michigan. I know you're probably a little higher on them than I am. Let's talk about Michigan through the prism of actually having to play teams with a pulse, which they haven't had to do much this year, and how is Michigan a good team that kind of stubbed their toe here, or are there some warts that we're now starting to see now that we have a couple of games of data to put against them against some decent defenses?
It's a fair question. Everybody, we talked about this strangely enough with Iowa a couple times this year, right? That everybody has good days and bad days, and Iowa fans see this huge swing game to game with their team. And what you hope is that you don't have a bad day at the wrong time with the other team having a good day. But there's little doubt that Michigan playing old, pro style offense just kind of curled into a ball when they couldn't run it. All season, Michigan has been able to stay sort of ahead of the chains, run the ball well enough to, generate some offense, except really for, 2 ball games. Really, you could say 3. Central Florida wasn't great, but that was a different issue because they got in garbage time. But against Wisconsin and against Iowa, both those games, they averaged under 3 yards a carry. And they scored 13 and 14 points in those 2 ball games. And I think the reason is when you're trying to run a pro style offense, a lot of it is predicated on play action and on bootlegs and on all that kind of stuff. And that requires the linebackers and safeties to be sucked in, because if they're not paying attention to the run, all those plays schematically kind of break down. And, it's the same thing we saw when Alabama and LSU played, right? That's even if everything else is kind of all well and good the same, it can just slow to an absolute freaking crawl if you cannot move the chains solely by running, and it puts pressure on your offense and especially your passing game to actually complete a pass. The defenses were very good. And it's worth saying here that as much as Michigan struggled, their defense freaking shut down Iowa too. They both had under 250 yards in this ball game. Iowa only had 66 yards passing, completed 8 passes, 3.5 yards per attempt.
What's interesting about that, there's a stat that I heard today floating around there. Iowa only had 14 yards of passing yardage that didn't go to running backs.
No,
That's
I totally
baffling.
Yeah, watching that game, I totally believe it. And if you look at I think one of the main things we saw is, and it's a lot like we talked about Etling with LSU, and I didn't have a ton of faith in Etling. Spate really hadn't been tested too much. Wisconsin is a very, very good run defense, but their pass defense isn't really exceptional this year. It's good, but it's not, necessarily the best in the world. It's 12th nationally in yards per attempt. That's great. QB ratings, good ratings, etc. But it's the run defense in the front seven that's really gotten them to where they are, and they can be out athleted a little bit. But Spate in this game, where he had to make plays, he doesn't really have the ability to do it. I would say Beathard's not that different. The QBRs for these 2 players was 10.5 for Spate, 6.7 to Beathard. And it really, at the end of the day, this is like we talk about. Anytime you get the scores get this low, stuff just gets kind of wacky because teams are just trying to hope to generate something at the right time. you can both teams can throw an interception, but if one throws it at the wrong point of the field, the other one throws it for the right point, how far the guy returns a pick, that kind of stuff ends up winning you the ball game.
So I know you keep talking about, and I think they're fair points about how Iowa mirrored Michigan in terms of lack of production and poor quarterback play. But the difference for me is we're talking about an Iowa team that gave up 35 to Purdue, that gave up 41 to Penn State, you know, 38 to Northwestern. So, and only managed 14 against Rutgers. I mean, you and me could go find 7 people, 10 people outside and score more than 14 on Rutgers. So, Iowa, in my mind, is a bad team that can play okay defense. Michigan doesn't really have an excuse. Now, I know letdown game and they can still win out and make the playoffs, but this is kind of a warning for them when we're talking about beating Bama and playing with the best. It's not looking good for Ohio State, much less beating Bama or even making it to the playoffs.
No, I mean, I have to agree with that. There were some warning signs last week too that we need to sort of re-examine some ideas we had about the Big Ten and their teams. Where's Michigan taken gotten a lot of clout? They blew up Maryland, they blew up Illinois, they blew up Rutgers, um, and then they had 2 wins early against Colorado and Penn State. And I will say those are 2 different teams now than they were when they played them. But other than Rutgers, Illinois, and Maryland, they had a 10-point, very close game against Michigan State, who's not very good. They had a 7-point win against Wisconsin. And that's kind of it. And what do I say about reevaluating some things? Well, how did those teams that Michigan beat this year? How did they do? Well, Wisconsin beat Illinois 48-3. Ohio State beat Maryland 62-3. Michigan State beat Rutgers 49-0. So those blowout wins by Michigan, everybody is blowing those teams out. Everyone. The only 2 games that really look impressive right now are those early wins against, Penn State, who is a very young team, and the quarterback really hadn't had that switch flip on yet, and Colorado, who knows how good the
They're
Pac
overrated. Colorado's overrated.
how,
I watched them play a UCLA team that didn't have Rosen and really struggled to beat them. Right now, Colorado would lose by any of the top 4 teams by 2-3 touchdowns. So I see where you're going with this. I will say, even though Penn State is playing a little better football, they almost lost to Indiana. I know that score because they had a late fumble. They almost lost. They were trailing in the fourth quarter. Could have lost to Indiana. But still, I think 49-10 over Penn State has to be probably the only game in their so far 10-game schedule that's of note. And to your point, when you're getting into game 11 or 12 and you've only got one game to hang your hat on, there's not a lot to go by.
Yeah, and when I talk about Penn State, I mean, be clear, right? They lost to Pitt 2 games prior, beat Temple by a touchdown. They beat Minnesota by 3 the next week. And it was Maryland. They kind of got some rhythm, and then they beat Ohio State. But I will also add to this, I would be a little cautious in buying into Ohio State too, because what I think we're seeing is the Big Ten is way more shallow than a lot of people realized. And that early on, people were just saying, well, Michigan and Ohio State are really good teams. They're going to run the table, yada, yada. I think there's just some Big Ten teams that are absolutely, absolutely atrocious, like Maryland and Rutgers. I think, if Rutgers could play almost anybody in the other power conferences and get totally blown out. I mean, their closest game, I guess, was 2-point loss to Minnesota. Otherwise, they beat New Mexico and they beat Howard. Washington destroyed them early in the year. I honestly think they could play a Vandy or a Missouri in the SEC, and Rutgers would lose by 3 or 4 touchdowns. And
Yeah, I think Vandy would beat them for sure.
so why am I saying that? I know it sounds like we're harping on it a little bit, but I know our audience isn't going to complain so much. A lot of the SEC fans listening, I don't really know how good the Big Ten is. we talk a lot about, comparisons and point comparisons and the way everything works. When you see these conferences, sort of play within themselves late in the year, pollsters tend to give a lot of weight to conferences that win, uh, you know, 10, 11 games from two or three teams over conferences that win 8 or 9. But here's the concept, right? You don't dole out wins based off how good or not good your team is, in truth. You earn wins relative to the competition. If you will, there is a bag of wins your conference gets for conference play, and every one of those wins gets pulled back and forth between two teams. So if Michigan and Ohio State and Penn State all have one or two losses, does that mean those three teams are really that good, or does it mean that there just isn't any parity behind them, for them to ever generate a loss? Or moreover, for some of the other teams, a lot of the second tier teams, I think Penn State may fall into this category. Is Penn State getting to, a 2-loss record or what have you, simply because there's no one else in the Big Ten that can beat them? And so we'll rank Ohio State and Penn State and Michigan really freaking high because they have one or two losses. But, if Ohio State loses to Michigan, they've arguably lost to the only two teams with a pulse that they played. I mean, we can talk about Oklahoma. I guess Oklahoma's a good win, and they beat
But it's
Wisconsin.
funny because your Oklahoma being at 11th right now kind of fits into this bag of wins concept because Oklahoma has beaten a bunch of horrible, horrible teams, and they're the best of those teams, but that doesn't mean they're the 10th best team in the country.
Yeah, I mean, Oklahoma does not have a win over a ranked team on their resume right now. They don't have one. Their losses are to Houston and Ohio State. Their wins over Louisiana Monroe, TCU, Texas, Kansas State, Texas Tech, Kansas, Iowa State, Baylor. Are any of those teams, does anyone have any illusion they're any good? And I should note that on those wins, they won by a touchdown repeatedly. TCU was a score. Texas Tech was a 1-touchdown game. Even Iowa State was only 10. They had to win late against Iowa State to pull away. Texas was a 5-point game. So, Oklahoma's going to end up ranked probably in the top 10 this year purely because there aren't any losses on their schedule. And I don't think there's any way to justify why Oklahoma would be better than, an Arkansas or a Florida. I mean, they don't have any. There's nothing on the resume to indicate it. But what's going to happen, I think, is the same thing. We've seen this go two ways. A few years ago, the SEC was probably greatly overrated when the Mississippis had very good records because the SEC was very top heavy. SEC teams had multiple teams make New Year's Six bowls. They had 3 of them. And that sort of bumped everybody up a bowl slot. And we saw the SEC teams lose a lot of bowl games that year. Mississippi State losing to Georgia Tech, on down the board. TCU went off. Alabama struggled in the Sugar Bowl in the playoff game. The next year, everybody said, "Well, the SEC is not all that good." The SEC beat each other really badly in 2015. The rankings were lower, and they got seeded lower in the bowls as a result. And what did we see?
9-2.
Right. And I don't necessarily think it's because the SEC was truly better, to be honest. I mean, they're the top tier teams in the other conferences, I think, were as good or better. The problem was if you had, all the other conferences got a relative ranking bump, so they ended up in a better bowl game than they should have. The SEC teams got knocked down because of the parity and the fact that they basically they didn't concentrate the wins in a few teams that got spread out. And all the SEC teams, as a result, really just got favorable matchups against what was really overrated teams in other conferences. So I wouldn't say the distinction there is it's not that the SEC was so good; it was that the SEC was so underrated relative to the other conference.
No, they're just that good. They're just that good. So go ahead, finish your thought, and then I'm going to pull us out of the weeds.
Well, and I think this is its own worthy discussion, right? But the SEC, I think we're going to see the same thing this year. I think the SEC is going to go into these bowl games. A lot of teams are really beat up. A lot of teams have, going to be 7, 8 win records. They're going to get low bowl ranking slots. There's going to be all the hype on their opponents because a lot of the other conferences are spitting out, West Virginia's and Oklahoma States that don't really have any indication why they're so good other than, they just don't have many teams they could possibly lose to. And all of a sudden, the SEC, I think, once again, is going to tear up the bowl schedule when these healthy SEC teams that are a lot better than their records play teams from other conferences that have greatly inflated resumes.
So, and I don't disagree with you there. One final thing on this Michigan Iowa game, we see how the AP poll, coaches poll, already coming out. Michigan's only dropped a couple of spots, and I don't know that that's unfair since all of their competition in the top 10 has also dropped games this weekend. And then you get into the 2 and 3 loss teams. Just because somebody loses a game in November doesn't mean that they automatically are 9 and 3. They could be 11 and 1. So, but if you're looking at what we know to this point, and I know you just basically said a lot of we don't really know, since we probably won't cover Ohio State or Michigan until the playoffs. Tell me, what do you think about this game, Ohio State, Michigan? Give me a score prediction. Give me who wins that game.
Whew. That game should be an absolute struggle for both teams. You think, Ohio? There's a lot of rhetoric right now that Ohio State, found their passing game, gotten their mojo over the past few weeks after the loss to Penn State because they opened up against Nebraska and Maryland. First off, there's not much evidence that Nebraska was very good, and Maryland has been blown out, as we said, repeatedly all year. There's nothing special about that. They're a terrible team. So both these teams have an issue. Both these teams really can't stretch the field vertically. Both of them play, old man football, if you will. However, Michigan is willing to lean on the offense, their defensive opponents, and just like a sledgehammer, run into them and test their will. Ohio State is much more of a spread finesse team. And when Ohio State has played defenses, and it's only happened a couple times, that are fundamentally sound and willing to line up and just play hard-nosed defense and force them to throw the ball down the field, offensively, Ohio State has no response.
And that goes back to last year, too. The only team they played that did that to them, that did that kind of football, was Michigan State.
And when Ohio State plays, defensively, and they play a team that is willing to line up and run the ball straight at them, because they are so young, because they've missed gaps, and because they just aren't all that old and big, really. They've got a lot of talented players, but they're younger. Younger means really less size, less strength. They've given up a lot of points. Wisconsin put up 30. Penn State put up 24 running the ball. Northwestern put up 20. So put those two together, I think Michigan wins the game. I think they win at something like 20-10, kind of a slugfest. But I don't think Ohio State is going to be able to move the ball with any consistency when they play Michigan in a couple weeks. I think that's going to be a bit of a shock because they're going to probably destroy a terrible Michigan State team this week. And then they're just much like, really ironically, like what happened to Michigan last year, where they went into a brick wall against Ohio State and all of a sudden their pro-style offense shut down. I think we see something of the opposite. I don't think Ohio State really has any ability to stretch the field vertically once that, short passing game gets shut down. And Jabril Peppers will probably get a ton of hype for that just because of the role he plays in the defense. But it's really a limitation on Ohio State.
I swear that guy eats breakfast, and people are like, "Oh, did you see how he ate that waffle?" And he's the Heisman. And I don't know. I think he's a great athlete. I think we're so desperate to give one of these like play both ways kind of defensive players a Heisman look that he's getting the most of it. Give me Ohio State in that game. I don't know. I think it's one of those things like Louisville where they're hot and cold a little bit, but when they're hot, and I think they'll be on for Michigan. But either way on that one, I'm not surprised. It's a tough game to call, like you said, just because of how they're playing and how much they struggle against good to great defenses.